Mechanic saw a quick $1,800 payday in the black customer standing before him until that customer revealed the engineering genius behind the very engine he was trying to swindle. The check engine light flickered on just as Marcus Washington was rounding the bend into Oak Ridge Heights, a predominantly white suburb nestled in the hills outside of town. Perfect timing. 10 minutes before his first major presentation at Horizon, Aerospace, his normally reliable sedan, had chosen this moment to protest. The car shuddered once, twice, then began to slow despite his foot on the accelerator. "Not now," Marcus muttered, easing the vehicle onto the shoulder. He loosened his carefully knotted tie as anxiety crept up his spine. After 15 years building his reputation at one of the country's top engineering firms in Atlanta, this move represented everything he'd worked for, a senior position designing next-generation aircraft components. Being late on day 5 wasn't an option. He pulled out his phone, searching for nearby repair shops. Miller's Auto appeared on his screen, a 4-star rated shop just 2 blocks away. The reviews highlighted skilled service, though many complained about the steep prices. Marcus glanced at his watch. No time to be picky. 20 minutes later, he stood in the cluttered office of Miller's Auto, watching as a middle-aged white man with thick forearms and grease-stained hands examined his keys with suspicious scrutiny. Frank Miller had been running this shop for 27 years, according to the faded certificates on the wall, taking over from his father, who had opened it in 1965. "That your car out there?" "The Avalon?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting disbelief. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied evenly, having grown accustomed to these subtle questions over his lifetime. "It just suddenly lost power on my way to work." Frank grunted, walking toward the vehicle without inviting Marcus to follow. But he did anyway, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the knot forming in his stomach. He'd felt this tension before, the immediate assumptions, the scrutinizing glances. "Nice car," Frank remarked, popping the hood. "How'd you come?" "Buy it?" Marcus straightened his shoulders slightly. "I purchased it 3 years ago." Frank raised an eyebrow but said nothing, leaning over the engine. After a cursory glance that lasted no more than 30 seconds, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Well, I can tell you right now you've got serious problems," Frank announced, his voice loud enough for the other mechanics to hear. "Your timing belt's about to go, and it looks like you've got a vacuum leak. Probably haven't had proper maintenance in years." Marcus frowned. The car had been serviced just last month, and he knew enough about engines to suspect something much simpler. "Are you sure? It was running perfectly until the check engine light came on." "Listen, son," Frank said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've been fixing cars since before you were born. I know what I'm looking at." He scratched some figures on a clipboard. "We're talking about $1,800, give or take. Can't say for sure until we get deeper in there." Marcus's jaw tightened. The sun hadn't escaped him, nor had the inflated diagnosis. A quick glance at the other customers, all white, all being quoted what sounded like reasonable prices for their repairs, confirmed his suspicions. "How long will it take?" Marcus asked, checking his watch again. His presentation was now officially delayed. 3, maybe 4 days, Frank replied with a shrug. "We're backed up, but we require a 50% deposit up front." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That gonna be a problem?" The implication was clear. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, one he'd learned to control through years of being the only black engineer in countless rooms. He had 2 choices: call out the obvious discrimination and risk further delays, or swallow his pride, pay the inflated price, and make it to his critical meeting. As he stood there weighing his options, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his new boss. "Board is waiting. Where are you?" "I've got other customers who were here first," Frank announced loudly after Marcus reluctantly agreed to the repair. He handed the keys to a young mechanic with a buzz cut. "Park it in the back." "Tyler, we'll get to it when we can." Marcus watched as Frank immediately turned to greet an elderly white woman who had just entered, his demeanor transforming entirely. "Mrs. Henderson, how's that grandson of yours doing at college?" Frank's voice was warm, friendly, unrecognizable from the cold tone he'd used moments before. "Let me just take a quick look at that noise you mentioned," Frank continued, escorting the woman to her vehicle. Marcus observed as Frank spent nearly 15 minutes examining her car, explaining each potential issue with patience and respect. "It's just a loose belt, nothing serious. Should be about $80 and we can have it done by lunchtime." Marcus's jaw tightened. He settled into a plastic chair in the waiting area, pulling out his laptop to prepare for his delayed presentation. Through the large windows separating the office from the garage, he could see his car, untouched, while mechanics busily worked on vehicles that had arrived after his. An hour passed. Then another. Customers came and went, each receiving immediate attention while Marcus's sedan sat neglected in the corner. When he inquired about the progress, the front desk attendant merely shrugged. "We're backed up. Frank's working as fast as he can." Near noon, Marcus stepped outside to call his colleague, Jake, who had covered for him at the morning meeting. As he returned, he paused at the partially open door to the garage, hearing Frank's voice. "These people roll in here with cars they can barely afford, then act surprised when they can't pay for repairs." Frank was speaking to Tyler, the young apprentice, while gesturing toward Marcus's car. "Trust me, he's gonna haggle when he sees the bill. They always do." "I don't know, Frank," Tyler replied, glancing uncomfortably toward the office. "His car looks well maintained. Probably just needs—" "Did I ask for your opinion?" Frank snapped. "Just do what I tell you." Marcus stepped back, his face burning with a familiar mix of anger and resignation. He made another call, this one to his new boss, explaining the situation. "I understand, Dr. Jefferson. Yes, I should be there for the afternoon session. I've reworked the presentation to highlight the titanium alloy applications first." Marcus spoke in measured technical terms, unaware that Tyler had emerged from the garage and was now within earshot. The weight-to-strength ratio analysis should address the board's concerns about the new wing design. With hours still to kill and his presentation notes complete, Marcus decided to understand exactly what game Frank was playing. He stepped into the garage during a moment when the front desk was unattended, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. His car's hood was open, but no one was working on it. Marcus glanced around, then quickly examined the engine. Just as he suspected, the issue appeared to be nothing more than a faulty spark plug. A $30 part and 15 minutes of labor at most. When he returned to the office, a preliminary invoice had been left on the counter. Marcus picked it up, scanning the itemized list with growing indignation. Complete timing belt replacement, 685 vacuum system overhaul, 420 fuel injection cleaning, 245 engine diagnostic fee, 150 labor, estimated 9 hours, 900. He quietly took photos of the invoice with his phone, then walked around the shop, examining the certification plaques on the wall. Frank Miller had completed advanced courses in engine management systems and was factory certified by several major manufacturers. This wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate deception. As Marcus studied the technical certificates, he became aware of Tyler watching him from the garage doorway. The young apprentice seemed to be assessing Marcus with curiosity rather than suspicion. "You know cars?" Tyler asked quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Frank wasn't nearby. "I know engineering," Marcus replied carefully. Tyler nodded slowly, his eyes darting toward Marcus's vehicle. "That's not a timing belt issue," he said, almost whispering. "I told Frank it looked like—" The door to the back office swung open, and Frank emerged. Tyler quickly retreated into the garage. By mid-afternoon, Frank approached Marcus with an even more serious expression than before. "Got some bad news," he announced, holding a new clipboard. "Once we got in there, we found your catalytic converter was shot too, and there's damage to the oxygen sensors." He handed Marcus a revised estimate. $450. Marcus studied the paper, then looked up. "That's interesting. The check engine light would have come on weeks ago if the catalytic converter was failing, and oxygen sensors typically trigger specific diagnostic codes." "Which codes did you pull exactly?" Frank's eyebrows furrowed. "Listen, I don't need to explain the technical details. Do you want your car fixed or not?" An older couple waiting nearby looked up, startled by Frank's tone. "I'm simply asking which diagnostic codes your machine pulled," Marcus continued calmly. "Piezo 420, Piezo 430. These would indicate catalyst efficiency below threshold." "I know what the codes mean," Frank snapped, his voice rising. "Been doing this for 30 years. Tyler had emerged from the garage again, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes moved between Marcus and Frank, discomfort evident on his face. "Frank," he interjected cautiously, "I didn't see any catalytic converter issues when I ran the get back to work." Frank balked. The waiting room had grown quiet, with all eyes now on the confrontation. Marcus remained composed, even as Frank's face reddened. Just then, Marcus's phone rang. He checked the screen, then answered. "Dr. Jefferson, yes, I'm still at the repair shop." He listened for a moment. "No, sir. I don't think we need to reschedule the entire board presentation. I believe I can address their questions about the propulsion system integration." As Marcus spoke, Frank's expression began to shift. The technical language and obvious expertise in Marcus's responses were unmistakable. The titanium composite. "We've developed reduces structural weight by 22% while maintaining tensile strength at high temperatures," Marcus continued, making eye contact with Frank. "Yes, I've run the simulations myself." When the call ended, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Marcus noticed several customers exchanging glances. "So about those diagnostic codes," Marcus said, his voice level. "I'd really like to know which ones your machine detected." Frank's previous confidence wavered, but he doubled down. "Look, you can either approve the work or take your car elsewhere, but no one else will get to it today. I guarantee that." "I see," Marcus replied. "Well, before I decide, perhaps you could explain exactly why a car that was perfectly maintained and serviced just last month suddenly needs over $2,000 in repairs. I'm very curious about the technical explanation." The tension in Miller's Auto had reached a breaking point. Several customers who had been waiting quietly now watched the exchange between Marcus and Frank with undisguised interest. "Actually," Marcus said, reaching into his wallet, "I think I should introduce myself properly." He pulled out a business card and handed it to Frank. "Dr. Marcus Washington, Senior Propulsion Systems Engineer at Horizon Aerospace, previously Lead Engine Design Specialist at Toyota's North American R&D Division." Frank stared at the card, his expression freezing. "Now, about my car," Marcus continued, his voice carrying through the now silent shop. "There's no issue with the timing belt. It was replaced during routine maintenance 8 months ago. The catalytic converter is functioning perfectly. There would be a sulfuric odor and significant performance degradation if it weren't." He walked toward the garage, gesturing for others to follow. Frank remained rooted in place for a moment before hurrying after him. At the car, Marcus pointed to the engine components with precision. "What we have here is a simple issue with the ignition system, specifically a faulty spark plug in cylinder 3. That would explain the sudden power loss and check engine light." Frank's face reddened. "Now wait just a minute." "The spark plug would cost about $8, Marcus continued calmly. "Labor should be 15 minutes at most, so roughly $100 repair, including diagnostic time." He turned to Frank. "Instead of the $2,400 you quoted me." The elderly couple who had been watching exchanged glances. The woman clutched her purse tighter. "Frank, is that right? Because you quoted us $600 for our alternator." "I know what I'm doing," Frank snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus reached toward the engine. "If you'll allow me, I can show you exactly where the problem is. Or better yet, I'd be happy to fix it myself if you'll rent me the space and tools for an hour." "You can't just come in here and—" Frank began, but was interrupted by Tyler stepping forward. "He's right, Frank." The young apprentice's voice quavered slightly, but gained strength as he spoke. "I ran the diagnostic when the car first came in. It was showing a cylinder misfire. P03003, cylinder 3, misfire, just like he said." Frank glared at his apprentice. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Actually," Marcus said, "Tyler does know what he's talking about, and so do I." He turned to the growing audience of customers. "I was part of the engineering team that designed this engine configuration. The 3.5-liter V6 has a known issue with the ignition coil on cylinder 3. It's a simple fix that Toyota addressed in later models." A murmur spread through the gathered customers. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "Frank replaced my timing belt last month. Cost me $1,200. He turned to Marcus. "How often do those actually need replacement?" "Every 100,000 miles, Marcus replied. "Or about 10 years of average driving." "Mine had 42,000 miles on it," the man said slowly. More customers began comparing notes, their voices rising in concern and anger. Frank's face had drained of color as he watched his reputation disintegrate before his eyes. As the situation threatened to explode into chaos, Marcus raised his hands. "Folks, I understand you're upset, but I'd like to suggest something constructive." The whole crowd quieted, waiting. "Mr. Miller clearly has the technical skills to run this shop properly," Marcus said, gesturing to the certifications on the wall. "He's invested years in building his knowledge. What if, instead of just pointing out what went wrong here today, we turn this into a learning moment?" Frank stared at Marcus with wary confusion. "With Mr. Miller's permission," Marcus continued, "I'd like to demonstrate exactly how to diagnose and fix the issue with my car. Anyone who's interested can observe, ask questions, and learn something about what's actually happening under your hood." The unexpected offer hung in the air. Customers looked from Marcus to Frank, waiting. "You want to give an auto repair class in my shop?" Frank asked incredulously. "I want to transform a negative situation into something beneficial," Marcus replied. "Everyone here deserves to understand what they're paying for, including you," he added, looking directly at Frank. After a long moment, Frank gave a curt nod, more out of having no alternative than genuine agreement. What followed was remarkable. Marcus rolled up his sleeves and, with Tyler eagerly assisting, removed the engine cover, and carefully extracted the faulty spark plug. He explained each step in language everyone could understand, answering questions with patience and clarity. "See this electrode?" he said, holding up the spark plug for all to view. "The ceramic insulator is cracked. That's why the spark was intermittent, causing the engine to misfire." The customers gathered closer, genuinely fascinated. Even Frank, standing at the periphery with arms crossed, occasionally leaned in to listen. "You really know your stuff," commented an impressed woman who had earlier been quoted $900 for brake work. "Where did you learn all this?" "My father was a mechanic," Marcus replied with a smile. "He taught me the basics before I went to engineering school. He always said understanding how things worked was the first step to making them better." The impromptu workshop concluded, Tyler handed Marcus the replacement spark plug with undisguised admiration. "That was amazing, sir." Frank watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. When Marcus had finished the repair and demonstrated that the car now ran perfectly, applause broke out among the gathered customers. In the silence that followed, Marcus approached Frank directly. The shop owner had moved to the far corner, away from the approving crowd. "Mr. Miller," Marcus said quietly, "I have to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." He met the older man's eyes. "Would you have quoted this price to anyone else who walked through that door?" Frank's face twitched. Decades of entrenched attitudes warring with the undeniable reality before him. Tyler had moved to stand beside Marcus, his presence a clear statement of where he stood. "What's right is right, Frank," Tyler said. "And this wasn't right." The weight of the moment pressed down as everyone in the shop waited for Frank's response. His world had shifted, his comfortable patterns disrupted by a man he had judged based solely on the color of his skin. A man who had responded not with anger or retaliation, but with dignity and expertise. Frank Miller stood at the crossroads of his entire belief system, forced to choose between doubling down on a lifetime of prejudice or taking the first painful step toward change. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Frank finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "No," he admitted, barely audible at first. "No, I wouldn't have quoted that price to anyone else." His shoulders sagged as decades of unchallenged beliefs crumbled under the weight of his conscience. "I was wrong." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the gathered customers. Some nodded in solemn acknowledgement, while others exchanged meaningful glances. Marcus could have walked away then, could have filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau, could have pressed charges for attempted fraud. Instead, he offered his hand. "There's a better way forward, Mr. Miller." That evening, after the shop had emptied of spectators, Marcus outlined his proposal. Frank would offer free diagnostic sessions every month, complete with transparent explanations of the issues found and fair pricing estimates. The community would get education. Frank would get a chance at redemption. "Why would you help me after what I did?" Frank asked, bewildered. "Because change only happens when we create the opportunity for it," Marcus replied. What neither of them knew was that Catherine Chen, a local news reporter whose car had been in for an oil change, had witnessed everything. Her feature story ran the following week. Discrimination Transformed: How an Engineer's Response to Auto Shop Bias is Changing Our Community. Within a month, Marcus had leveraged his position at Horizon Aerospace to establish an apprenticeship program targeting underprivileged youth interested in engineering and automotive repair. The program would provide hands-on experience at local businesses, including Miller's Auto. "You have real talent, Tyler," Marcus told the young apprentice after arranging a scholarship opportunity for him at the state technical college. "You stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult." Meanwhile, Frank's business faced immediate consequences. Longtime customers demanded transparency, new customers arrived with cautious skepticism, and every repair was now scrutinized. For the first time in decades, Frank Miller had to reconsider how he ran his shop and who he wanted to be. 6 months later, a visitor to Miller's Auto would hardly recognize the place. A large price board hung prominently in the waiting area, listing standard repair costs and labor times. The staff had expanded to include mechanics from diverse backgrounds, including Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in electrical systems who had previously been turned away by Frank because customers wouldn't trust a woman mechanic. Every other Saturday, the shop hosted community workshops led by Marcus, who volunteered his time to teach basic car maintenance and demystify automotive care. Attendance grew steadily, with participants ranging from teenagers to seniors. Frank's transformation hadn't been easy or instantaneous. There were moments of backsliding, of defensive anger, of embarrassment so acute he considered selling the business. But with each interaction, each time he worked alongside people he once would have judged or dismissed, another crack appeared in the wall of his prejudice. "I never thought I'd say this," Frank confessed to Marcus one evening as they closed up after a workshop, "but these Saturday sessions are the highlight of my week now." The shop had become something of a local legend, a model for how businesses could embrace transparency and community service. Other repair shops in the region had begun adopting similar practices, feeling the pressure of customer expectations shifting beneath them. On a crisp autumn day, Miller's Auto hosted its first charity event, Community Repair Day, offering free essential repairs for families in need. Frank and Marcus worked side by side on a minivan belonging to a single mother of 3. Their hands moving with the synchronized efficiency of longtime colleagues. Nearby, Tyler, now in his 2nd semester of engineering school, was showing a young black teenager how to change brake pads. The boy's eyes widened with understanding as Tyler guided his hands through the process. "You got it, Dion," Frank called over, offering an encouraging nod. "You've got a natural feel for it." Dion's smile lit up the garage. Later, as the successful event wound down, Marcus and Frank stood in the evening light, watching as families drove away in safely repaired vehicles. "You know," Frank said quietly, "my father taught me everything about cars, but nothing about people." He paused, searching for words. "I spent 40 years judging folks before they even opened their mouths." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of this admission. "The thing about engines," Frank continued, "is they don't care who fixes them. They just care if you do it right." He looked around at his transformed shop, at the diverse faces, at the community that had cautiously embraced his redemption. "Took me a lifetime to see that the same is true for pretty much everything else." As they walked back inside, the lesson was clear. Confronting discrimination didn't always require destruction. Sometimes, when met with dignity and the opportunity for education rather than mere exposure, it could lead to transformation, not just for one person, but for an entire community.